Hello everybody, it's Courtney, and today I am using one of the new stamp sets by Honeybee Stamps called Buttercup. And I'm starting here with my Misty and taking a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I'm going to be creating a little field of buttercups here. So I'm laying out my 3 images, and I'm going to be stamping with Barely Beige ink by Simon Says Stamp. I'm going to try a little bit of no line coloring, and I'll be honest with you, this scares me and I'm not very good at it, but because I'm going to be creating some grass, and obviously that will not have a black outline to it, I wanted to keep it all cohesive and have no border around these little flowers. So once I stamped my first 3, I went ahead and masked those out with Eclipse masking paper, and I'm just playing around with my placement to add a few more of those flowers to my little field. And I'll go ahead and stamp that with the Barely Beige ink as well. I am double stamping here, that's why I'm using my Misty, just because it is very hard to see on camera. Normally, if I'm doing any kind of no line coloring, I would only stamp this once. But it's just a little bit easier for you guys to see if I double stamp. Next, I took another piece of the Nina Solar White, and I'm going to be stamping all 3 of my flowers separately, not worrying about placement. I'm going to be fussy cutting these out later, and I double stamped these as well. For the coloring, I'll just show you the 3 flowers that we stamped separately. The other flowers on the card panel, I'll be coloring the same exact way. So buttercups are very bright yellow. So I played around a little bit with the shading. And first I'm starting off with my lightest color, which is a very, very bright yellow. It's my Y02. And then I'll go in and add just a tiny, tiny bit of shading where each petal meets or where it's folded over. And I'm using my E15 here, which seems very dark. And it is. But once we get to our midtones and back to our lightest color, it won't appear so dark. So my shading for that middle petal there that is laying over the other 2, I'm just adding a few flicks right there in the center because I don't want my 2 darkest areas touching. Because we don't have this bold black outline of the stamp, we have to create our own lines. We have to create our own shadows even more than we normally do. So you want to make sure that no 2 dark areas are touching, or else you won't have the separation of the petals. I'm going in with my lightest midtone and my lightest color more than the other 2 colors, which is usually opposite of what I normally do. But I wanted to make sure that these remain pretty bright yellow. For this next flower, these petals are kind of folded over and laying on top of one another. So again, just going over my darkest areas with my lightest color, and then going in with my E15. And I'm putting such a light line down for my shading that sometimes I'm barely touching the paper. So you'll see kind of like little dots there. It's because I'm just barely touching the paper. I don't want that ink to spread too much because I want my darkest color to just be my highlight. Basically, you're outlining the image except for the edges of the petals. Next, I'll go in with my darkest midtone and blend that line out just a little bit, and a few of those flicks there in the center. Then with my lightest midtone, which is my E08, I'm taking that out pretty far, leaving a generous highlight, but still for more than I normally do. Last, I'll go back in with my E02 and cover up the entire image. For this last flower, this one is wide open. So I started with just putting shading down in the center, and I felt that that was going to be a little too boring. So I added a few little flicks there on each of the edges of the petal to kind of make it look like the petals are kind of bowed out a little bit. In the end, you can't really tell because these colors are so light and the mid-tone and the lightest color are so similar to one another. It really didn't give it the effect that I was looking for, but I kept it anyway. Starting with my darkest color there in the center, I'm not putting this on the edges of the petal. I'm saving that for my darkest mid-tone just because I don't want these edges to be overly dark. And I'm just doing very, very small flicks. I don't want to go too far into the center of the petal, and I don't want this to be the main focus of the flower. So then I'll go in with my lightest mid-tone and extend each of those flicks out from the center as well as from the edges of the petal, leaving a pretty small highlight in this case for my Y02, which I'll go over pretty much the entire flower with that color. These, at this point, look like a hot mess. They have dimension, but they kind of just look like blobby kind of. So we're missing the little stamen in the middle. We pretty much covered that up, being it was such a light ink that we stamped with. So I'm just going in with my white gel pen here, adding a few dots and a few quick little flicks to connect those dots to the inside of the flower to make it look like the stamen. I don't really even care if they match up perfectly. It's just to give the illusion that these flowers have those stamen. For the stems, I'm going over with my lightest color, which I ended up not even using. But because I don't know how these are really going to lay on my card panel, I'm just concentrating on my darkest areas being on the top and the bottom of the stem. So where it would be coming up from the ground and where it's kind of laying underneath the flower. Blending that out with my mid-tone, and then my lightest color is my G21 instead of that G20 that we started out with. Now for my card panel itself, I colored two of the flowers the same exact way as I colored these, and the flowers that I'm going to be covering up with these flowers, I just colored solid yellow. Number one, this gives me an idea of where to place my shadows, and it also, in case you can kind of peek underneath the flowers once we add those with my phone tape later, I want to make sure that you don't see white, you see yellow. Next, I'm adding blades of grass, and all I'm really doing is taking my lightest color, which is my G20 again, and this is mainly if I make a mistake, it's easily taken away with a colorless blender. The blades of the grass will be thicker on the bottom and kind of just flick out to nothing on the top. And I'm making these all various sizes and starting off with my lightest color. Not only if I make a mistake, I can cover it up, but if I decide to make a blade longer, I can before I do my shading. Now for my shading, I will start off with my darkest color, and most of the time I try to keep in mind where the shadows will be. Like this blade of grass is laying underneath this other one, so there'll be a shadow coming out from underneath that. And I'm adding just a little bit of the dark and mid-tone on the top part of the petal just to give a little added dimension. But other than that, I'm not really worried about too much shading here. I kind of just place dark colors and mid-tone colors and light colors scattered throughout just to give it a little bit of contrast, and it doesn't look like one solid piece of grass. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up because I colored the rest of the blades of grass the same exact way, but I will show you the rest of them, kind of where the shadows will be for the blades of grass that are laying underneath some of the flowers themselves. The stems of the flowers that are completely covered, or colored rather, I am coloring the same way as I colored the other ones that will be fussy cutting out. Concentrating my lightest color just there in the center. Now once I get to my lightest color there on the top of the blade of grass, I'm using that flicking motion, but just in a larger scale. So instead of little tiny flicks that you use when you're coloring, you're going to start with pretty much the entire tip of the marker down and then flick that out to nothing. That's why I started with my lightest color. So if I didn't get that shape of the blade of grass, I could always go back and fix that. And I just used that as my guide when I did the rest of my coloring. Next, I will go ahead and add a little bit of broken china distress ink. And I'm going in with a very, very light hand. I'm barely touching the paper. Starting from the top and working my way down, I'm not going to cover the flowers, but I'm going to basically go until it's no longer giving off any ink on my ink blending tool. And you may have to go over this a few times because you're using such a light hand, but you want to make sure that you avoid getting those marks on your paper from the foam. Next, I'll bring out my Misty again and line up my sentiment. I'm using my Misty here just because the word Buttercup is pretty large, so if I don't get a solid impression the first time, I can restamp it. I'm stamping with my VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And I did go ahead and fussy cut my flowers off camera. And this can be a little tough when there's no black line to use as a guide. And I'm sorry, my cutting mat there is really crooked. But I went ahead and popped those up with some foam tape. And the stems, I cut very, very skinny strips of foam tape. If any shows through, you can always take your green marker and kind of just cover up those areas. You'll never be able to tell. I took my scissors and just snipped off any excess that might be hanging off the card panel itself. And I took a few clear sequins here and just added a few around the sentiment with my glossy accents. And that is it for today. That is the whole card. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.